And the interesting thing, I guess you will all know, is that Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. But the problem we have in Scotland, and I have to mention our independence debate as well, is that whatever we think, we are always outvoted by England, because we are only 5 million, like Kyrgyzstan, and they are 55 million. Because we are clearly different and becoming more different by the day, then the Brexit vote has prompted the political position to now go for another independence referendum. And if we become independent, we would want to stay in Europe. We can never do that so long as the big decisions about our future are taken in the Parliament in London. We do have the Parliament back in Scotland, and that was a huge change for us because we hadn't had a Parliament for 300 years. And since that Parliament came, it's been better. However, it has limited functions, and it's mostly domestic functions like education, roads, power, and so on. However, the Parliament in London still controls foreign affairs, most taxation, defence, for example. So, for example, the position in Scotland is one that we don't support nuclear weapons. But the Parliament in London has just voted to renew the Trident missile system, which it buys from the US for billions of dollars. And we believe those billions of dollars would be better invested in services like education, health, and so on. In addition, when the analysis was done of who voted for independence and who voted against independence, overwhelmingly the over 55-year-olds voted to stay with England. The 16 to 35 years old overwhelmingly voted to leave. So the future is in our young people. That's who are the future, and eventually they will win. So it's only a matter of time. And interestingly, after the vote and 5 days before the vote, the UK political parties got together and bribed Scotland, saying, we'll give you more powers. And so actually it was a win-win situation for us, because although the referendum was lost, we have acquired some more powers, but typically not all the promises that were made have been kept. The social media were exposing the lies, and lots of people began posting, particularly on Facebook, and providing the truth. But of course, social media is mostly accessed by younger people. So the influence of social media was more apparent for the younger age groups. And the interesting thing is that some of those who were posting on Facebook, for example, have now become guest columnists in a new newspaper that came out of the referendum debate and started publishing immediately after the vote. So now, as well as traditional journalists writing for that newspaper, it's called The National. And the existence of a new newspaper is very unusual nowadays, because overall sales of print media are falling. But this one has survived now for 2 years and hopefully will have a long-term future. I think because they offer good data sources to contradict the message that's coming from the traditional media. You know, I could probably best illustrate that with the terrible stories that were in the English press about immigration prior to the EU referendum. And they were based on lies and mistruths and lack of data. Yeah, there is a YouTube clip. If you if you go on YouTube and you search for BBC protest in Glasgow, that protest never featured on international media or anything, but it was before the referendum, and it was people protesting outside the BBC's headquarters in Glasgow about their misreporting. And of course the BBC are very experienced, and the way they would misreport would be subtle, but it's insidious, which means that it feeds its way into people's consciousness. Well, like most media, they're often, even although there may be claims of editorial independence, most media is influenced by who owns it. And although all citizens in the UK technically own the BBC because it's paid for through a form of taxation, okay, that is allocated to the BBC, but the allocation and the contract, if you like, it's called their charter, is decided by government. So to some extent, the BBC will always be influenced by government. And therefore, it meant that they were largely adopting the position held by the government in London. During the run-up to that, one newspaper came out in support of independence, and that newspaper is called the Sunday Herald, who were a Sunday-only publication of a sister newspaper called the Herald, who are largely a fairly objective daily newspaper. Its owners, interestingly, are not Scottish. I think, I couldn't be quoted on this, but I think they're Canadian. Okay, so the Sunday version had a different editor from the Monday to Saturday editor. And the editor for Sunday decided, because of all the hostility from the traditional media to independence, that they would declare their support for independence. So they did that. Then the demand for their newspaper rose. And almost immediately after that referendum 2 years ago, they decided, that same editor, to publish 5 days a week. And they did so, but they called it a new newspaper, The National. And after a period of maybe a year, they upped it to 6 days a week. So currently they're doing okay. We tolerate a whole variety of views. However, those who are extreme, let's say the right wing who are racist, they have attempted to have their own protests, say, in Glasgow or Edinburgh, and there will be small numbers, you know, maybe 50, 100 people. But what then happens as soon as it's known that they're going to protest, because in our country, you have to normally apply to the city council to say you're going to have a protest. Okay? So what then happens is that those who are against racism will mount a counter-protest, and they always outnumber the extremists and essentially shame them in public. So I respect their right to say what they think. I don't like what they think, but there are other ways of dealing with that. And I think it's important that everybody's voice is allowed to be heard, because if we didn't realise how what the thoughts were of different groups, then how can we decide what our ideas are? I think there are many ways that you yourselves have already decided you can improve things. And as an observer, what I would say is it's perhaps naive to think that Europe is great. Also naive to think that Scotland is great. We have problems. And the spread of democracy through Europe is actually fairly recent in historical terms, because only 40 years ago, Spain, Greece and Portugal were dictatorships. They weren't democratic. And if you think of what I've been saying about Scotland's position, then although everyone has the vote and we can express how we feel, we are always dominated by a bigger partner. And that's a democratic deficit that's there. And it's taken 40 years to reach where we are now. So back to your country. Your country has the same population as Scotland. But there will come a point, and it's already happening with some issues, where you know your own future and you can make it happen. Okay, there are still problems in the way that the country is politically organised, how you resolve long-standing issues, but unless you refer to the history of why things are the way they are, then you cannot know where you're going. So refer to the history, learn from other people's experience, and make your own choices. And I think that's what will make it sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable if people like me from Europe come and tell you what to do. That's not the way. It's about learning from each other and then deciding your own future.